Hey everyone, this is Steve from GamersNexus.net, and if you are wondering where I am, it is in a luxurious hotel room, not really, in near Santa Monica. Today is a Game 24 event. I am already there. If you're seeing this video, it is hosted by NVIDIA to launch the GTX 980, and that is what we are reviewing today. I have fully benchmarked the GTX 980, and we've looked at the architecture, written about the architecture in full detail, very detailed. Hit the link in the description below for all of that information, and benchmarked it in games. So with the 980, first of all, it's not an 800 series. NVIDIA has skipped the 800 series for desktops. They kept it for notebooks. Then we had a huge delay waiting for different things to fall into place for the new 900 series. And so they've shipped it as the GTX 900 series. And the 980 in particular has had a lot of questions lately and a lot of broken embargoes, a lot of rumors. And users are generally asking why it's less powerful than the 780 Ti. Well, what you're going to find out today is that that's not true. That is complete BS, and everything you've seen online about that is either uninformed or uninformed, basically, is all it is. So we have the full specs here. The 980 and 970 are both launching today. The 980 has 2048 CUDA cores, which you may notice is about 800 fewer than the 780 Ti. So then how can the 980 be more powerful than the 780 Ti? Well, the CUDA cores are more powerful. So that's kind of why all of these early articles that are based purely on speculation are incorrect, because the cores are more powerful themselves. They're about 40% more powerful per core. So that's a lot of extra power. You can do that math yourself if you would like to, but base clock is 1126 on the 980, 1216 boost clock, 5 teraflops of single precision performance, which is a lot, and there's no DP performance listed. As far as I am aware, this is not a DP card, it is not a Titan card, and therefore is focused on single precision. Memory configuration, 4 gigabytes with a 256-bit bus, and the speed is 7 gigabits per second. However, it is effectively 9 gigabits per second, and I will explain why in a moment. That is due to new technology. Uses 2 6-pin power connectors, no 8-pin, and it's got 3 DP ports, DisplayPort, 1 HDMI 2.0 port, and 1 DL/DVI port. Now, as far as the power, TDP is 165 watts for the 980 and 145 watts for the 970. If you pay attention to power connectors, a single 6-pin power connector from the power supply can sustain about 150 watts constant power. So that means if you wanted to, you could probably run a 970 on a single 6-pin connector, you being a manufacturer, and that would sort of eliminate overclocking potential. 5 watts is not enough overhead for overclocking, but if they ran it slightly dropped in performance or the same performance, theoretically you could do it on a single 6-pin, which is interesting for HTPC applications. Now, in terms of the features, before we get to benchmarks, there are a lot of new features with the GTX 980, with the 970, and with Maxwell architecture as a whole. This is on a Maxwell GM204 chip. That is the new chip. And specifically, NVIDIA has added what it calls dynamic super resolution, or DSR. It's added MFAA, or multi-frame sampled anti-aliasing, which is a new alternative to MSAA. That's pretty cool. I'll walk you through that. They've updated their VXGI suite to 3rd generation, so that's basically a voxel graphics illumination, global illumination type of technology that makes for very cool dynamic lighting effects to be sort of more feasible in gaming environments. They have what's called VR Direct. VR Direct is dealing with latency on HMDs, head-mounted displays like the Oculus Rift, to make the user less seasick in use. And they've done color compression, which is where we get the memory effective speed I was talking about a moment ago. So let's sort of walk through these very quickly. Hit the link in the description below for full details on any of these if one particularly interests you, and then we'll get to the benchmarks. Starting with DSR. DSR is called, it's dynamic super resolution. It can be thought of as similar to downsampling. It's more similar to downsampling than super sampling, and the difference between those is that super sampling is rendered at the native resolution of the display, whereas downsampling is rendered at a higher resolution and then downsampled to the native display. So the reason NVIDIA is focusing on something called DSR, which is a better version of downsampling, is because they say that 95% of their GeForce users are still on 1080 displays, and I can definitely see that being true. 4K is getting popular, but it's not there yet. And in the conference call, NVIDIA, I think, worded it pretty well. They said if you're playing a game like Dark Souls 2, you're playing a game like, I don't know, Trine, something like that, Grid, that's not particularly graphics intensive to begin with, or is an older game even, then making it go faster doesn't get you anything. It doesn't do anything for us because you're already running at such a high FPS that what's another 100 FPS going to do on top of that? So they have said that they can improve quality, image quality, by adding effectively a better version of downsampling or a sort of different version of super sampling. And what that means is that the card is rendering, with DSR, the card is rendering the game at a new resolution, so that could be 1440 or that could be 4K. I tested with 4K. So it's rendering the game at 4K. It is treating it as if you have a 4K monitor when you do not. That means you're getting 4x, 4 times the samples per frame than you are with, or 4 times the passes, I should say, not samples, per frame than you are with a 1080 setup, because it's 4 times larger. So that means the textures will look better, the colors will look better, everything's generally sharper and has more defined lines and shadows and things like that. If you look at any 4K screenshots, you'll see what I mean. And DSR emulates that pretty darn well, and in fact it's basically equivalent to the 4K screenshots from a real 4K monitor. So it scales, it renders the frame at 4K resolution, then it scales it down to 1080. It filters it down, I should say. And in the filtration process, they use what they call a 13-tap Gaussian filter. And I've described some of that in the article, but a lot of it, frankly, goes over the boundary of our website and sort of in terms of technical discussion. So it uses a very advanced filter to display the 4K resolution frame on your 1080 monitor, and that tricks the GPU into thinking it's playing 4K, and that makes the user get an experience that looks more similar to 4K. You're going to have some issues with interfaces, but overall it looks pretty good. So this is a technology that has been added in GeForce Experience, and it's specifically added just so if you have a 980 and you have a game that's getting 100 FPS, 200 FPS, you can run it at 4K resolution, it'll look better, and you won't really suffer too much in terms of spending tons of money on a monitor, so you can just get the video card instead. So that's DSR. Check the article for more details on that. Let's move on quickly to color compression. There's a new technology NVIDIA has updated called 3rd generation Delta color compression, and that's just really a fancy way of saying that when we draw a frame with the GPU, we look at the colors on, let's call it frame N. We look at the colors on frame N, then we look at the colors on frame N+1, the next frame. And we specifically get the delta between the colors on each frame. And that helps the GPU in lowering the demand by drawing only delta values of colors instead of redrawing an absolute value of the color. So this is a compression technology. It's compressing the color data being sent to and from the frame buffer on the GPU, that's the memory effectively, and by compressing that, we can fit more other things into that memory bandwidth, into the pipe, and that allows for a better overall experience. So what happens is, in this color compression process, looking at the screenshot I put up of Grid, you'll see everything in pink is something that has really not changed all that much. Anything that's not highlighted is either a new color, or it's moving too fast, or something's going on in the game where the GPU needs to either fully redraw that absolute value or get a more specific delta, depending on if you see any pink in there at all. So that's sort of an example of what the GPU sees with color compression. In terms of the performance, this color compression compresses the data about 17 to 18% over what is natively sent to and from the frame buffer. So that means you can fit 17 to 18% more stuff into that pipe because you're not using it on colors. And that gives us an effective memory speed of 9 gigabits per second on Kepler. In other words, if you're on Kepler architecture, you would need memory at 9 gigabits per second to achieve what Maxwell can do on 7 gigabits per second. So that's sort of what your effective speed is, and that does aid in bandwidth because bandwidth is not free. And that is color compression. Moving on very briefly to MFAA, this is a new anti-aliasing technology, is multi-frame sampled anti-aliasing as opposed to MSAA. MSAA is pretty dominant right now. You have almost definitely tweaked settings in games for MSAA, and it always comes in a flavor of 2x, 4x, 8x, 16x, things like that. What that number means, 2 and 4 and 8, that is how many samples are taken per pixel when you're drawing a frame. So if we have 4x MSAA, you are taking 4 effectively color samples on each pixel in the frame. That is millions of samples, because with a 1080 display you already have a little over 2 million pixels. So that's why anti-aliasing is such a demanding technology when it comes to rendering, and why you should always drop it first when you're trying to improve performance. Now, MSAA takes all 4 of those samples from various locations on the pixel at one time, and if it's got geometry slicing through it, if the object ends, or if the colors change, then anti-aliasing looks at the different locations on the pixel, determines where that color change happens, and then determines what color the pixel should be. So that's why you get a smoother transition between edges when you have AA enabled. With MFAA, it's a little bit different. So let's assume you are using 4x MFAA versus 4x MSAA. MSAA is on the right side of this image, MFAA is on the left side. In this image, each block, collective block, represents 4 pixels. Each single square in the block, of which there are 4, is a pixel. You can see with MSAA, we're collecting 4 samples per pixel. So what that means, they're in very specific locations on the pixels, on the geometry, and you can see that they are the same as the 4x MFAA locations. So we are not really changing too much about the technology here, and even though this is a simplified image, it is indicative of how the tech actually works in-game, in process. With MSAA, we're collecting all 4 samples per pixel simultaneously. With MFAA, we're collecting, in the instance of 4x, 2 samples per pixel over a period of 2 frames. So we have frame n, and we have frame n-1. So in frame n-1, the previous frame, we already sampled 2 spots on the pixel. We took 2 samples of the pixel color. In frame n, we took 2 more, and you'll notice that we are merging them together. NVIDIA has merged these frames together on Maxwell, and it's effectively sampling the same as 4x MSAA over a longer period, merging it, and that ends up with more compressed data transmission, and we can fit more in the pipe. And so ultimately what happens is 4x MFAA has the appearance of 4x MSAA. It is not a whole new visual masterpiece. It has the appearance of it. However, it renders at about the performance of 2x MSAA. So if you wanted to run, say you're playing a game where 8x anti-aliasing is a little too heavy on the 980 or other Maxwell chip. This counts for the 970 as well, by the way, all of this. If it's a little too heavy for that, then you can run 8x MFAA, get the same appearance as 8x MSAA, and you'll be doing it at the performance of 4x MSAA. So that's sort of a lot of data. The article in the description below describes it a bit more clearly if you need that, but that's the idea of MFAA. Pretty cool stuff, and overall why Maxwell, despite having fewer cores, is performing better than Kepler in many ways. Now, of course, there's also a lot to go on with the architecture, with the streaming multiprocessor, all that stuff. We're not getting into that right now. So that's all the new technology. We've talked long enough about this. Let's fly through the benchmarks. Again, article in the description below for full details, for full graphs and charts if you need more time to look at these. I am not going to show all of the graphs in this video. There are too many of them, so we're just going to look at a few of the most important ones. Let's start with let's start easy. We'll start with Grid Autosport on maximum settings. Now I have more GPUs I've tested than this, but they're not on max settings. Here we're specifically looking at flagships and a mid-range 770 for clarity. So in this example, we have Grid on maximum settings, including anti-aliasing at 16x. This is not using MFAA. MFAA is not yet available. It will be out sometime soon. I'm hoping within the next week. NVIDIA is trying to finalize that on the driver's side. So this is normal anti-aliasing. And with it at max, the 980 effectively blows everything else away. It's pretty close to the 780 Ti in performance, but despite what you have seen on the internet all week, the 980 is more powerful than the 780 Ti because the cores are different. It's not a one-to-one comparison, just like Intel cores cross-generation are not one-to-one comparisons, just like AMD and Intel cores can't be compared, just like CUDA and streaming processors can't be compared. So the 980 outperforms the 780 Ti by a couple frames per second, and the minimum FPS, I don't want you to focus too much on that because min FPS is always an outlier almost by definition. I actually use 0.1% time FPS instead of minimum, so it's a little better, but focus on average and 1% low. Now the 780 performs at 95.4, the 290X 85.9, so quite a bit more power in the 980 than the 290X, and the 770 at 71 FPS. I should note at this point that all of these cards are shifting in price and availability. NVIDIA will be discontinuing the 780 Ti and 770 from today forward. They will not be making any more of those GPUs. So if you are buying one, do it now. But the 980 and 970 will be replacing it in price in some ways, so don't worry too much about that. Moving on to the next screenshot, we have Grid on ultra settings. This is just to give you a better look at all of the cards I've tested. So we have the 980, the 780 and SLI, the 780 Ti, 780 290X, all those cards, and I'll just let you kind of look over that and get a feel for the performance. Check the link for a longer view of that graph. Let's move on to Metro Last Light. This one's pretty interesting, as always, to test because it's very intensive, and anti-aliasing is extremely intensive. So with Metro Last Light on very high settings with high tessellation, that's effectively max, but with SSAO and some of the anti-aliasing disabled or lower settings, we end up with the 980 4GB card at 86.4 FPS with a pretty high 1% low of 59 and an outlier 22 minimum. So again, don't focus too much on that. The 290X is at 81 FPS, pretty high. Actually, I was surprised that it outperformed the 780 Ti in some instances with some settings in Metro. The 780 Ti is 79 FPS. So again, 980 is more powerful than the 780 Ti, and that's really all you need to know in terms of NVIDIA's stack. The 980 is now at the top of it, unless you're looking at something insane like a Titan Z, which is not really for gaming. Moving on to Metro Last Light with maximum anti-aliasing settings and maximum every other setting, including tessellation. We have the 780 Ti and 980 are within margin of error of each other. You'll see that the 780 Ti really caught up a lot in this test. I'm not 100% sure why that is. This test was conducted multiple times and averaged. So they are within margin of error. They're 0.7 frames apart. But for all intents and purposes, these cards are effectively identical when using current technology before getting into MFAA and things like that. The 780 is a little bit lower than that. It's at 47 FPS. The 290X, 46.7 FPS. So they're all sort of within spitting distance of each other. But the 1% low on the 980 is the best, and that's a fairly important metric. Battlefield, you can see all of these results in the article. I'm not going to dive too deep on these. Let's instead jump to DSR. So I tested DSR with a few games strictly on the 980. I do not have a 970. I can't test it on that. You can't run DSR on the older cards, really. And the 290X, I didn't want to do a different type of sampling. It would have to be super or down sampling, and that's a different technology, so it's not a linear comparison. So we're looking at only the 980. Titanfall, DSR, was running at almost 52 FPS. It was at 51. not quite 60. I call 60 playable, so you're just a bit under playable. And you could drop some of your settings, maybe your texture settings or something, and you would be hitting 60 pretty regularly, and it would be at a 4K resolution. Looks very good. You can see screenshots of various games on the article or here in this video to see a difference between the larger resolution and the smaller one. So thermals are in the review linked in the description below. All the other charts are in the review in the description below. The video card, the GTX 980 and 970 both launched today, effective 7:30 p.m. PST, the 18th at Game24. And the 980 is $550 retail. That is a very competitive price, especially when looking at the 780 Ti's launch price. The 970 is $330 MSRP, and the 760 is now being dropped to $220 MSRP. Very affordable. Suddenly the 760 is competing with the 280, 280X. So those are the new prices. Everything should be available today, effective at embargo lift. Check the article for all the links to the products, all the descriptions, all of that good stuff. And let me know what you think of the 980. Pretty big in terms of technology. The architecture is very cool. And yeah, thanks for watching. I will see you all next time. Peace.